We're thrilled to be here this morning, Christofer Nelson, Sara Holoubek, and it's wonderful to be with this community of people thinking about how we open innovation, collaborate more within our organizations and with the rest of the world. When I was asked to be a part of Crowdsourcing Week, I thought about what I've seen in almost 10 years of being involved in open innovation efforts in some way or another. And I really feel that our work is at an inflection point right now. And so was thrilled that Sara and her team at Luminary Labs had just completed this report and reached out and asked her if we could have this conversation this morning, which we envisioned, in big leather-backed chairs with a fire between us, talking about the state of open innovation. But I really admire the work that Sara's doing and the contributions that she's made, and wanted to talk about kind of this preliminary study that they've done on where we're at as a field, as a set of competencies, as a set of practitioners in open innovation. And so thank you, Sara, first of all, for agreeing to let me co-opt this wonderful work that you've done. I think that, what we should start with, though, is why have you done it? What motivated you? Like I said, I saw this as an inflection point. I want to know why you were motivated to do this and what got you into that.
Sure. So I'm Sara Holoubek, CEO of Luminary Labs. We're a strategy and innovation consultancy in New York. And we started running challenges back in 2011, and every few years we would ask ourselves, are we going to do this again? And what we saw over the years was that organizations weren't just doing one-off initiatives, they were starting to build a competency. We started to see individuals who were responsible for open innovation much more broadly, maybe going beyond a challenge or a hackathon, but developing open data platforms, for example, or engaging in citizen science. So we were very interested in understanding what the state of the competency is. How is it being built out? What's the rationale for it? What are the benchmarks and what the future looks like? You can download the report, it's absolutely free. We surveyed roughly 100 organizations or individuals, and those are the area of inquiries. And they come from different sectors. It was very important to us that this be open to not just public sector, but private sector and nonprofit, some academia as well. These are all individuals who are actively practicing open innovation, and that's a very important point.
Yes.
Right. So,
and probably representative of most of the people in this room who are actively practicing open innovation in some way, shape, or form.
But for the rest of the world, it's still a relatively new concept. So we wanted to know explicitly, if you are practicing it, how are you doing that today? An interesting side note is that we had a disqualification question, and a lot of people would disqualify themselves, and we would write back to them and say, you're quoted in the Wall Street Journal as having run this large-scale open innovation project. And they said, oh, you consider a hackathon open innovation? Oh, you consider open data platforms open innovation? So we left the definition really broad. So we had to return to people, and that first learning was really around nomenclature and the lack of that vocabulary.
Well, and so just to dig into that a little bit further, how did you define open innovation for the purposes of this? And then what did this teach you about how the rest of the universe, or at least a subset of that universe, is starting to define open innovation?
Yeah, it was really hard. We had just seen a survey around open innovation that was produced by Innovation Leader in KPMG, and in it, they referred to crowdsourcing, open innovation, and prize competitions as three different things. Or I would consider them all sort of a subset of a larger thing, open innovation. So we wanted to make sure we got the words right, and so we had to boil it down. So what we did is we talked to folks like Christofer and Kristen Dargalo and other individuals that we had met along our trajectory in this space to see if the words made sense. And as it turns out, everyone had a different opinion. So we had put a stake in the ground, and we chose to delineate between internal efforts, so like internal crowdsourcing versus external external crowdsourcing. We decided to include things like open data, open science platforms. We decided not to include accelerators because in many organizations, accelerators can mean that it's not really open. It's sort of like an intake valve, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is truly open, especially in the private sector. I think that might change in a future survey.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that will be interesting, and you and I talked about this at the very beginning of sort of you're starting to think about the survey, is part of doing it this year is to start to put a marker down and to see how that definition changes over time. Because I think as the practice, as the competency builds, people are going to start to think about it in different ways.
Yeah, I would say broad stream media tends to think of it as hackathons and challenges, and that's it. And we wanted to be very clear that it meant all things open.
So if we think about all things open, what was the sort of top line state of open innovation right now?
Right. So the first question is really how the competency is organized and where you are in that organization process. So you can look at this chart here. Only 26% of the organization said that they had a mature competency. The gross majority, 59%, said they're still developing the competency. I don't think that's surprising. It's not yet mainstream. I am actually very encouraged by that 59%. To me, that suggests that 5 years out, if those 59% continue to develop the competency, we're going to have a number of reference points that we can look back to say, this is what good looks like in the private sector, this is what good looks like in the public sector, so on and so forth.
And one of the interesting things that you measured that we'll get to in a minute, but that I was reflecting on in reading the report was part of one of the things that we were measuring, and I see many government faces in the room, in one dimension of thinking about government open innovation, a report that I was responsible for, and many of you contributed to, where we were looking at specifically the prize practice within federal agencies. We wrote a report every year on that. One of the things that we tracked was where that sat in an agency, and did it sit, in the leadership of the agency? Did it sit down here? Did it sit way over here on the side? Was it in multiple places? Was there a central hub and spoke model? In looking at that, you asked a similar question on your survey, and I'm curious what you found as you looked at a broader cross-section of public and private sector.
Well, we went into this with a lot of hypotheses around who would be centralized and who would not be centralized, and we were completely wrong. There's actually really no rhyme or reason. We tried very hard to find some correlations, but as it turns out, about 47% of the respondents have a centralized open innovation competency, 37% have not centralized, and 16% say unsure or neither. Some of them in the open-ended comments would say things like it's scattershot, like we might have a center of excellence, but we also have somebody going rogue. So we don't actually know if centralized or decentralized is a good thing or not. Centralized might be a good thing to create that knowledge base and disseminate it. It might also mean that it's an ivory tower. Decentralized might be great because it's actually in the DNA of the organization. It could also mean that people are just doing things left and right and not sharing best practices. So in a future survey, I think we would want to qualify this, like is this what you aim to be in the future, or is it simply what it looks like today?
And I think we see it building from both of those angles, right? We see both that grassroots, bottom up. Hey, we're gonna try this crazy thing over here, and somebody else in an organization goes, man, that worked, and we're going to build on that. We also see leadership deciding that this is something we're going to start doing, so we're going to build this out. And I'm not sure that either of those approaches are right or wrong, but it will be interesting to track that over time as the competency grows and changes.
And I think the private sector is very different. In the private sector, there's this idea of ownership, and like, I did this good, great, awesome project, and you can't steal my idea. And we've experienced that, somebody running an incredible open innovation program and feeling like they didn't get credit for the next one. Whereas I think in the public sector, nonprofit, you want to spread everything like peanut butter, right? You want everyone to be using open innovation.
And so thinking about the people who are doing that spreading or not spreading, what did we find about the roles of the individuals?
So this was also interesting. We asked whether open innovation was your sole focus or a part of your job. Not surprising, only 38% said it was their sole focus. That changes slightly with larger organizations who are more likely to dedicate resources against open innovation. For most people, it's just part of their job. They're doing other things. We did look at titles, and we saw the emergence of Open Innovation Manager as a title. That's an emergent title right now, Head of Open Innovation. But there's this beautiful chart of really every title of everyone who participated, and it's everybody from the C-suite to VP of technology to, an operations lead. There still is not that formalized idea of a title being associated with a competency. And the question is, should there be?
Well, and I think you have an analogy that I want to draw out now, because I'm mindful that we only have so much time to talk about this, and I think this starts to point us to where we go next, even as we beat through a few of the extra results, and how you're thinking, well, how this report uncovered the way that open innovation is at this inflection point, as demonstrated by the role of the people in organizations.
Right. So this reminds me of 1999, when there was one person in the organization who knew how to make a website. And it was somebody's nephew. And then a few years later, this individual became like digital lead. And then there was a small digital team. There was also, the traditional team, mostly in marketing. It was advertising at that time that was driving the digital transformation that we see today, which is now pervasive across organizations. But fast forward 20 years, and many organizations are still struggling with, how do they become more digital? They've built out teams, they've built out competencies, and now nobody owns digital. There is no digital team in a major corporation. Everybody is expected to have a digital component. The underpinnings of the business are digital. So we believe that open innovation is going through the same thing. Right now, there's one person in a corner who knows what open innovation is. He or she is swimming upstream, socializing the concept inside the organization, getting some quick wins, having some proof points, getting more budget, maybe gets the title. I have a colleague in the pharmaceutical sector I've known for years. He's been a fan of open innovation challenges and so on and so forth. He is now head of open innovation as of last month. So I think we're at that inflection point. Yes.
Well, and we're seeing it both in terms of the people and in terms of the organizational strategies, right? As you described the digital team, you can also think about an organizational strategy that had a website and then had an app and then thought about their database infrastructure and now, if they're not thinking in that digital way, in that future-looking way from a technology standpoint, they're just not relevant. And I think from a strategy standpoint, we're going to increasingly see open be plugged into the strategic components of an organization, that collaboration plugged into the strategic components of an organization more and more. So just to beat through the final points of the report in terms of the activities, the goals, and the sort of barriers that we're seeing right now and what that might show us for the future.
Sure. So in the benchmarking section, we wanted to know what you were doing and what the goals were. And it's really interesting. On average, individuals selected more than 4 goals. So they were trying to accomplish a lot of things with open innovation. And you'll see development of viable solutions, concepts. It does vary by industry, so and by sector. If you're interested in a data slice, you can reach out to us and we can provide that. But what government said versus, say, private sector, even healthcare. Also interesting is that on average, they were sponsoring or executing 4 or more activities. All of this sort of suggests that we try to map this in many different ways and looking at the type of organization. Again, no real rhyme or reason. And what it appears to us is that we are in a period of experimentation. People are trying a lot of things. They're mapping it against different goals. And the only real indicator of sort of a look-alike organization are those who have more mature competencies plan on doing less things. It doesn't mean less open innovation, but they've sort of narrowed their focus a little bit. That's sort of the only indicator of a look-alike model at this point. But again, it really reiterated just how early it is and how people are still getting proof points.
Do we want to go ahead and talk about goals really quickly, and then?
Yeah, so I quickly went through that. And sort of mapped the goals to it. But we did think it was really interesting that it did. Some of them simply want to be positioned as an innovator, which is not I get it. It's not necessarily the end goal, but this idea of developing viable solutions really being at the top was really, it was heartening to hear. Yes.
And then the barriers really quickly, and I know our time is short, but I would love to take just one or two quick questions from the audience. So maybe we'll take two questions and then try to answer them together. So finish with the barriers, but be thinking if you have any questions.
Right. So, of course, you want to ask people what's in their way. And we had to laugh because almost everybody said time. Like, time was the most popular answer. But we thought about that and said, if you asked anybody what their barriers in work would be, it's like it's always
The number of hours in the day. Yeah. Right.
So this is interesting. It did change by sector. So you'll see time, funding, internal goal alignment at the top. If you are in the private sector or nonprofit, you actually have goal alignment more than funding and time. So there was less of a concern that people needed to align on goals because there was a mandate. In the private sector, you have a lot of C-suite folks arguing about what they want to do or SVP levels, and there isn't internal goal alignment, but they have a ton of money, right? So we thought that was interesting. Tech, well, if we slice that out of the private sector, it was really time. They have goal alignment, they have money. It was really like, do we have the time to do this? And that makes sense. They've been great champions of all things open for years.
So are there a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up with a final thought or two? We'll take two questions and try and answer them together.
This will be actually a quick question. I'm curious on splitting this between sectors. Is there governments? Do you have government as well?
Yeah, I can give, if you want, I can give you a government slice, the things that we found that were different amongst those participants, yeah.
Is that very legal?
No, my hypothesis was legal was going to be at the top for everybody. I was really surprised at how low that was. Just my own personal experience. I try to hug lawyers. That's my thing with Open Innovation. Just hug the lawyers and invite them to the first meeting.
Let's take these two questions, and then
So we have
we'll
that.
have some wrap-up thoughts. So there, and then.
So did your survey ask any questions about sort of return on investment and sort of what these organizations sort of saw, and is there a divergence between how public and private sectors sort of?
Yeah, so it's a very good point. We debated that internally. We decided to ask about tactical goals for open innovation activities. We did not necessarily ask like specifically what the expected return on investment is, but we did interview 11 individuals and look at the open-ended responses as it relates to rationale. And almost everybody mentioned Joy's Law, going mainstream, that collaboration is the new competitive edge. And for the true believers, they believe that it is not so much a thing or a methodology, but that open innovation is a philosophy. And Sandeep Patel from HHS put it brilliantly, and that's in the report. It's this idea that this is an entirely new way of working. It's not like, okay, we need a line item for open innovation in the budget. I think in a future survey, I think we would have enough respondents who'd be able to answer that. Yeah.
Here's your question.
Yeah, so the question is, there's sort of a hypothesis that on one side, novices, people who are not domain experts, can really contribute very well to open innovation, and another one that, and it doesn't have to be either or, that you need to have domain experts to be creative and have open innovation. Have you looked at that question and whether you require domain experts to be able to do great open innovation and achieve great results versus novices, or
Oh.
a combination thereof?
Everybody there said there are no experts. Like we're all inventing this as we go. So are you talking about the software base or the people doing the?
Talking about people innovating in a particular industry or company, do they need to be domain experts, or like you got to?
Which domain? Open innovation as a domain, or the actual thing they're trying to work on, like the
I
industry?
think that they're trying to
That's a good question. We didn't ask that, but I think, most people responded that, I would say I'm just kind of thinking back about the response. Most of them, they already worked at the organization. They know that organization. They're bringing the open innovation lens. But I would argue, anyone who hires a partner, vendor, consultancy, they're not necessarily subject matter experts in what you do. And they have to ramp up quickly. So being a quick read is really important, right? So there are people, our organization, we ramp up on the craziest of all topics in a relatively short period of time, yeah.
So then, just final takeaway thoughts for the people in this room who are largely the practitioners of open innovation within their agencies, organizations, companies. Where do they go from here?
So, well, when you read the report.
Well, stipulated. Beyond that.
There's a really great section in the report towards the end that I want to highlight, which is how do you socialize open innovation in your organization. There are 3 individuals that gave us very concrete things they are doing, sort of like boot camps inside of their organization, a type of roadshow, a way to sort of spread that peanut butter, which, by the way, I'm stealing that from Amin Bandari, who is the person who encouraged us to run our first challenge. So if you quote me, that's actually from him. So how do you spread that peanut butter? How do you make sure that everyone's on board? That was one really great learning. There's also a really great section from Tom Khalil on advanced market commitments and milestone payments, which is something that I do not believe is widely used in open innovation and should be.
Yeah, and I think that that's the horizon scanning and the tools that are the next generation of thinking open. So I know that our time is short. I hope this has given you a snapshot of, some where we're at in this work. I think there's a lot more to come. I think you all are at the forefront of that in a lot of the work that you're doing and thinking about how you continue to build that competency for yourself, for your teams, and start to socialize this work across your agency. So.
And last note, I think there was this overwhelming sense of positive energy and excitement. All of the forward-looking statements were about this building, and despite obstacles, were really quite positive. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christofer. Thank you, Christofer.